few events have given me greater hope about UMaine's ability to not only continue our progress on the road to solutions, but to serve as a role model for the way that all of higher education can rise to meet the world's future sustainability challenges than the arrival of Heather Leslie to become the director of the Darling Marine Center. Now, she's not quite as away from Maine as I am. She came here right out of college to work at the Darling Center. She comes from good stock. She did an undergraduate degree at Harvard and worked with both Jane Lubchenco and Bruce Mengi at Oregon State. Did a postdoc at Princeton. She's been on the faculty of Brown for a while. But some of the really formative experiences happened when she grew up in Massachusetts and kind of experienced firsthand the complexities of these problems about how we're going to think about people and nature and the way they interact and what we need to do to kind of chart a sustainable course. She has had a lot of wonderful papers in places like the Proceedings of the National Academy, as you saw there, Conservation Biology, Frontiers, and Ecology of the Environment. She is a Leopold Fellow, which is a nice thing to be, and it's a great privilege to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, David, for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to be here. Does this go back in? There we go. I think it can be in. And this is a place that I've been wanting to spend more time ever since I first set foot on campus in this new decade, this new time of moving to Maine last spring. So it's really wonderful to be here and have the chance to talk with all of you. And I have two goals for this talk. The first is to give you a bit of a sense about the research that I've done and that I'm doing now and that I hope to do going forward, particularly here in Maine. And the second is to start a conversation that I'm happy to say I've begun with at least some of the folks in this room, but I hope you'll all consider it started after this next hour. And that's to invite you all to think with me about how we can continue to build on the momentum to engage UMaine students, faculty, staff, and partners in developing sustainability solutions in new places and in new ways. And I see the Darling Marine Center and the fantastic staff and faculty and students and facilities we have there as a great place to think about doing work in this area in the broadest sense of the word. So please, my title is definitely aspirational. I'll reflect a little bit toward the end, but as I say, this is the beginning of what I hope will be many conversations about how we might work together on developing sustainability science research projects and real-world solutions. So in the next, that clock is about right. In the next 35 minutes or so, I'd like to take you through several elements. The first is to talk a little bit about me and my background. As David mentioned, I'm an ecologist trained at Oregon State University for my PhD, and I'll explain why now I consider myself a sustainability scientist too. I'll also talk about the study system where I've been doing sustainability science work, coupled natural human systems work, particularly intensively for the last 6 or so years, and at least for the next 3, thanks to the U.S. National Science Foundation. And then I'll talk about some of our recent results, and that's the reading that came up earlier. So you can go to that paper. I'd be happy to provide you with other papers that describe the work that we've done recently and give some idea of where we're headed next. And then I want to talk about here and what we might do here together, and that's where I'm hoping we'll switch into more of a dialogue mode. My slides end, and I'm looking for ideas and engagement with all of you. So first, as David mentioned, I grew up in Massachusetts. I didn't go very far for college, but and spent some really formative time here actually on the Maine coast at the Darling Center, and felt like doing science, focusing on marine science for my PhD would enable me to be a contributor to marine conservation and natural resource challenges. And so I went off and I spent a lot of time looking at very small bits of rock on the Oregon coast for about 5 years and learning a lot about the population ecology of barnacles and other marine invertebrates. But at the same time, I was also engaged in ongoing policy discussions about how to design parks off the coast of Oregon and California. And I had the great honor and challenge to actually be sharing my dissertation research from its proposal stage onward, not about barnacles, but about marine protected area design with stakeholders who were wrestling with these challenges of how to site marine parks, how to site marine reserves off the Pacific coast of the U.S. And I was trying to be useful as a scientist. And as much as I still love barnacles, and if you want to study barnacles or mussels, please do come and talk to me, because we'll get to it at the Darling Center in a little while. By the way, how many students are there here? Fabulous. Okay. And how many people are here who would consider themselves marine scientists? Even better, the definite minority. Okay. And how many of you have heard me talk before? Okay, great. That's good too. All right, so a fresh audience, because there are some pieces from last spring that I'll touch upon. Anyway, so as I was saying, I love barnacles, but not everybody in the world does, I recognize. And I realized that to be more useful, I needed to think a little bit bigger about the sustainability challenges facing our oceans and how I might use my scientific training to engage with those. And like all of us, I love people too. And so thinking about people as part of coastal marine ecosystems and explicitly orienting my science to engage with the dynamics of both human systems and the ecosystems that they are part of has really been my research agenda and challenge for the last decade. I finished in 2004 at Oregon and then spent some time at Princeton. So it's been about a decade that I've had this explicit shift toward coupled systems, and that's brought me to Baja. And in Baja California Sur, there's an amazing, as I'll talk about in a moment, there's an amazing opportunity to think about both the human and ecological dimensions of natural resource challenges, but particularly small-scale fisheries. And I have to say that I don't think I would have approached it in the same way if I hadn't spent time here on the Maine coast first. So in many ways, what I've done in Baja, I've done because I couldn't get back to Maine just yet. And so it really is fabulous to be here. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that this is a team effort. David and Ruth give each of the speakers some explicit questions that we're supposed to address in our remarks, and they're big questions. But one of them is, how do you bring people with different disciplinary expertise together to solve problems? And I can tell you all sorts of stories about how not to do it, but I can also, through this work, hopefully give you a little bit of insight of how to do it in a way that does work. And the first is to find people you like. And so this group of folks with whom I've worked really closely over the last several years, they represent really diverse expertise. Each of us in our own way has spent a lot of time in the Gulf of California region that I'll be talking about today. And we also have a lot of respect and interest in making our science relevant for solving societal challenges. And there are a whole host of other people who I could have put on slides, partners from the fishing communities where we've been working, partners in the local non-governmental organizations. These are sort of the thought leaders in terms of how we've gone about doing the research part of the project. And I am glad to see that there's more than marine scientists here, because, of course, this challenge of trying to do research that's relevant to societal challenges and then translate it in ways that are salient to what people are trying to accomplish is not something that's specific to any one ecosystem type. What is common, I think, across all of these systems is the fact that we people are part of them. We rely on systems, natural systems, for many different types of benefits, many different types of services, whether it's food or generation of knowledge or recreational opportunities, water, shelter. We have deep, deep ties to natural systems regardless of the state that we find them in. And so understanding those ties and how to have those dynamics be more sustainable, both for people and nature, has really been the focus of my work this last decade. Just to orient you to the place I'll be talking about next, Mexico's Gulf of California is in the northwest part of the country, and I've focused particularly, let's see, this part, on Baja California Sur, which is the southern half of the Baja Peninsula. It's the least populated state of Mexico's 31 states. Many parts of it are incredibly remote. The capital, La Paz, is right here, and that's one of the several focal areas for our research. We also have, essentially, at this point, we're actually working in fishing communities throughout the region, but a lot of the field work that we did in the last several years is focused on this Gulf region, and I can explain exactly why if you're interested. The reason for focusing on this region in general is its tremendous, well, there's several reasons, but certainly one is the tremendous biodiversity of the region, both on land and in the sea. I could just as easily show you the pictures of endemic cacti here, but instead I'm focusing on the almost 900 fish species that are found in the Gulf of California, that body of water between the peninsula and the mainland. There's almost 181 marine birds, 34 marine mammals, including the vaquita, of which there are maybe less than 200 now in the world, due to both fisheries interactions as well as habitat loss. And then close to my heart, there's a great many number of endemic marine invertebrates, and almost 5,000 marine invertebrates in all in this region. So it really is a very important place from a biodiversity standpoint, and many of the large NGOs, including Conservation International, have called it out as a place for prioritization from a biodiversity perspective. From a human perspective, the Gulf is also tremendously important. It's one of the fastest growing regions of the country in terms of economic development. It really is the frontier. And from a natural resource point of view, the Gulf produces more than 70% of Mexico's fisheries by biomass. And Baja California Sur, where I've been working, contributes a major portion of that 70%. And importantly for my story today, the majority of the people who are working in these fisheries are small-scale fishermen. They're working out of boats that would fit between these two tables in the front of the room. They're quite small boats, less than 30 feet in length, and it's usually 2 or 3 individuals, usually men, who have you can't see it in this picture, but a outboard motor or 2 on the back of their boat, and are using fairly simple, low-cost gear. In this case, a net, but hook and line is also another popular mode of fishing. And different than many other fisheries with which you may be familiar, this is an incredibly species-rich fishery off the coast of Baja California Sur. So more than 140 species are caught by fishermen working in that state alone, based on analyses that we've done of Mexican government fisheries data. And the species that are caught vary widely in terms of their life history as well as their value. So here you see some of the more sedentary species, chocolate clams that my student Cara Pello is studying in Loreto, scallops, spiny lobster, and then also much more highly migratory pelagic species, more wide-ranging species like yellowtail, and there's another story about yellowtail, but we'll come back to that, sharks, and Spanish mackerel. So just really a wide range in life history types, which is really exciting for me as an ecologist, because of course, people use different strategies, different foraging strategies to catch these different types of species. The fact that some fishermen are switching among these different life history types through the seasons, or for other reasons, makes for a really interesting set of couple dynamics. There's also a really big difference in value. Most of these species are worth $1 a kilo, but spiny lobster is worth $12 a kilo when they're landed on the beach. So that too creates some interesting dynamics. The other reason why this, well, the third or fourth, I guess, why this is an interesting place to consider the couple dynamics associated with small-scale fisheries is that climate variability has a really marked role on what happens both to the ecological system as well as to the social system. So here I'm showing you two sea surface temperature maps from La Nina, the cold water phase, and El Nino, the warm water phase. And you can see the increase in temperature, the warmer colors here in the El Nino phase in 1997. And not only is there a big difference in terms of water temperature through time with these two phases, but there's also tremendous variability north to south. And we see this same type of variation on a seasonal cycle as well. And in fact have found that by studying seasonal variation as opposed to these longer term trends, we can begin to learn about adaptive capacity of fishers. But not only do fishers differ in their response to this climate variability, we also see species-specific responses. So here, this summarizes many different studies of life history variation responses to climate variability. And if you look at the year after an El Nino event, that warm water event, you see that some species respond positively. Their population biomass or population numbers increase after El Nino, whereas others respond very negatively. And you see some that are quick. These are the wide-ranging species, or species that can get out of the way of the warm water, whereas other species, it's a recruitment channel effect. So in the case of leopard grouper, juvenile habitat is lost with El Nino conditions, and therefore juveniles don't recruit where they usually recruit, and you see the effect 7 or so years later after in the fishery data. So again, it's another layer of complexity, the fact that not only are these species varying in their life history and fishers' foraging strategies vary accordingly, but there's also these differential lags in terms of climate variability. The final element of this landscape, this social-ecological landscape that I want to be sure to lay out, is that fishing cooperatives play a considerable role in shaping how and where and when fishers fish. And many of the people in Baja California Sur who are exploiting the species that I showed you earlier are part of these fishing cooperatives. And they join fishing cooperatives. We have data from interviews and from participant observation as well as from surveys that indicate that reduction in the cost of fishing is the primary reason why fishers are willing to pay the costs, both time, money, and otherwise, to join cooperatives. And in return, they're able to share gear. They have access to government subsidies for gasoline, motors in particular. And so it's worth it. Yes?
One of the other things that they have as a benefit, which is something that I've discovered in Maine with the relatives, they also have access to each other. They just collect each other's phone numbers so that they can avoid paying Coast Guard fees. If they get stranded, fines, not fees, they're fines. If they get stranded, or if they're stuck out in a storm, that's also a benefit.
Yeah, I'm not sure how information sharing and safety fits in with this particular group. I don't know, I can't think of any data. There may well be information from the interviews that would help inform that.
Yeah. But I know that something's developed here.
Yes, yeah, so certainly this is not the only place where people have studied cooperatives, right? And I thank you for making the connection to the small scale boats in this region. Yeah, and it is important, the context matters. So in this case, what we hear, the primary reason for people joining cooperatives in Baja California Sur really is the access to government subsidies and also the chance to commercialize their product. So not everybody has to travel a day or more to sell product in the market, but rather there's one person who negotiates that, perhaps even with a middleman. So that's a way that costs are reduced. But the important piece here also is that not everybody belongs to cooperatives. So we have these local organizations that vary in their functionality, that vary in the rules that they place on their members about how you can fish, where you can fish, when you can fish. But then there's also independent actors in the system who are not abiding by the rules of cooperatives. And so having those people who are not part of the local institutions creates further complications. So in the midst of all that complexity, my colleagues and I, several years ago, we sat down after a couple of field visits and sharing of stories about what we knew about the region, why we were working in the region, what we hope to accomplish, and we tried to figure out what we could do together. Anthropologists, economists, ecologists, oceanographers, what could we all do together? And I'd had several other experiences leading interdisciplinary projects that I think went all pretty well, in the sense that we produced academic papers, we received funding, people flourished individually, and our colleagues seemed to think well of some of the things we were doing. But one thing that dissatisfied me about those earlier collaborations that had nothing to do with the system I'm describing here was that we were still very much working next to each other. And we had somebody doing economic analyses or telling us or trying to share with us how we might do that if we could figure out how to have the proper data. We had someone else doing really interesting ecological work, but everybody was essentially working next to each other, not really with one another. And what I realized is that to break through that silo, I found it very effective to share half-baked ideas. And that if I just, if I came and said, well, I love the Gulf region. I don't like deserts, but it's so interesting that there's these incredible physical shocks on the system. We can see different effects on species because there's ecologists who've studied that in great depth. And there's even some suggestion that that influences then the economic and social responses of fishers, but we can't quite pin that down. Does anyone want to help think about this? How might we look at those dynamics in a robust way and really bring theory from across the disciplines to bear? So by bringing half-formed questions to this thoughtful and patient group, I found that we could really build something together. That's proven to be a fairly effective model. And the other thing is to start really small. So one of the first things we did was to have a model of the system that was incredibly simple, that looked only at how economic demand influenced how and where and what people fished and what the effect was on one species of fish for which we had a lot of data, thanks to logbooks that were shared with us by the fishermen themselves from several different locales. So this was essentially a bioeconomic model, and I could draw lots of other reciprocal arrows, how change in fish population then affected the market demand and so forth, but then it gets kind of messy. But the point is there's essentially only three elements here that we're tracking, and then the interactions among these different variables. And by taking this bioeconomic approach and, again, parameterizing our model using data from the fishermen themselves related to prices, behavior, and fish population dynamics, we were able to come up with some really interesting and surprising results. And I'm not going to focus on those today because I want to get to the core story, but I'm happy to talk about it offline. That was simple. Then we tried to get a little more complicated and go back to my climate question. This is a system that is shocked by climate, actually seasonally, not just on a multi-annual cycle. We've realized the seasonal variation in climate, which then affects not only the population sizes but the location of different species, has a tremendous influence on how and where fishers fish. And depending on the rules that different cooperatives abide by, if everybody follows the rules, what we call an exclusive cooperative, the dynamics of this coupled system are really different than if there's a lot of actors who are not following the rules that some folks are abiding by. And of course, whether you consider market demand exogenous or endogenous, that too plays a really important role in driving the dynamics of this system. So here again, we've taken a bioeconomic approach, a little more complicated bioeconomic approach, which is why it's in the World Bank Economic Review, but there will be a translation next year for the rest of us. And the neat thing about this paper is that we can actually see the climate signal. In the messiness of the logbook data from fishers, we can see that fishers fish differently depending on where in the ENSO cycle they are, how hot or cold the water is, and also which type of species they're fishing. So they're much more conservative in fishing the species that are negatively impacted by El Nino events. And theory would predict that local institutions would self-govern and respond to climate and life history variation. But to be able to pull that out of fishers' logbook data, I find incredible. So what have we learned thus far? We've learned, first of all, that market-driven effects on how fishers fish can shape both ecological and economic outcomes. And this is just in a few locales in Baja California Sur. We've also seen that climate variability's impact, empirically, again from logbook data, are mediated both by the rules that a given cooperative has, as well as the different milieu or the different the suite of species that the fishers are fishing, whether or not they're really susceptible to the climate variability. And so in both these cases, the take-home message for solutions is that you can orchestrate a win-win, something that benefits ecology and benefits people. But you see that, and I'm happy to talk about these results in more detail, but the bottom line is that it's really quite constrained, that you need the institutions just so, and you need just a certain set of species, or else things blow up. So that's exciting from an academic standpoint, but it's kind of I guess what I've always found, what's fallen short for me about this is that it's really small scale. It just has to do with a few places. And just like on the Maine coast, it's not just a matter of thinking about 1 or 2 or 3 coastal or inland locales. We care about the sustainability, the robustness, the adaptability of the entire state, the entire coast. And so what I've been trying to figure out from the beginning of this project is how do we scale up from needing really data-intensive, quantitative models to something that can tell us more about the big picture. And what we stumbled upon, again through lots of conversations and half-baked ideas, was a way of answering this very simple question at the top of the slide. Do different places on the Baja California Sur coast, do they vary consistently, socially and ecologically? And how do we capture that variation? And what might it tell us about the sustainability of small-scale fisheries in particular? And so to address this question, we synthesized spatial data gathered in a wide range of ways, both from government sources as well as our own field work, social and ecological field work. And we brought those data together using the framework developed by Lynn Ostrom and colleagues, the social-ecological systems framework. And if you're looking for a short explanation of the social-ecological systems framework, this 2009 paper by Lynn Ostrom is a really good place to start. The surprising thing about this framework, it's been cited and written about more than 2,000 times since Professor Ostrom published this paper in 2009. It's a big reason why she won the Nobel Prize in Economics several years later. Yet in the almost 2,000 applications of this work, there's actually fairly little quantitative operationalization, that's not really a word, quantitative translation of this very important idea of how we think about the dynamics of the people and nature in an integrative, theoretically grounded way. And so that's what we've tried to do in the Baja California system. And I'm excited for people to poke holes in it and help me figure out how we can try to apply it again here in the coming years. But just to walk you briefly through what the framework is, again, focused on this particular context, there's essentially 4 main suites of variables we're interested in. The fish species that people are fishing and the ecosystem within which they're embedded, the coastal ecosystem. That's on the ecological side. And then on the social side, you have fishers and other key actors like the buyers who then bring those fish to market from different locales. And they're embedded in these local institutions, particularly the cooperatives I was talking about before. Now, to actually get at the dynamics you need to look at what happens when these different elements come together and what outcomes are created both ecologically and socially. This is a huge effort, and people have done this using case studies. People have done this using theoretical models. We didn't try to go there. We have not tried to go there yet in the Baja system. All we've tried to do is to quantify these 4 main variables in a consistent fashion and in a way that can be then duplicated or replicated in other social-ecological marine systems around the world, and that's work that's still in progress. And of course, you can see that there's factors that are important outside, related ecosystems and political and social settings. So there's some jargon associated with this framework from the 2009 paper and many others by Ostrom and colleagues. We call this the resource system, our ecosystem. Resource units are fish in this case, actors are fishermen, and the governance system are these cooperatives or other local scale institutions. And you may not like those words, but that's kind of the jargon of the discipline, so I share it with those of you who are interested. And from this social ecological systems framework flows 2 main hypotheses that we tested in this work that was published earlier this year. The first is that regions or places on the coast where people are fishing that have greater potential for sustainability on the ecological side also would have greater potential for sustainability on the social side. Okay, this is just, there's all sorts of theory that would support this idea, that if you have a productive ecosystem, then it should be easier to get along. That's our hypothesis to test. We also, based on the 2 bioeconomic modeling projects that I alluded to earlier, as well as work by many other people in this region and elsewhere, we expected to see spatial variation in the potential for sustainability in these different communities. We expected that some would be very high functioning, both socially and in terms of ecosystem health or fish biomass, and that others would be less functional. So those are the 2 simple hypotheses. In order to test those hypotheses, we had to go through a number of steps, essentially to blend these many different types of data we have and bring them together in a way that are relevant to the social ecological systems framework. We then used descriptive statistics to look at trends in the relevant data. How does primary productivity, for instance, vary from place to place on Baja's coast? How do the number of people who participate in cooperatives vary along the coast, and so forth. And then we use non-parametric rank statistics to convert those many different variables into a common framework. And this is all exhaustively described in the supplemental materials of the paper. It's hard to explain in a couple minutes here, but I'm happy to dig into it in detail with anyone who's interested. The point is we have a systematic protocol that was well vetted, that could be done other ways, and I'd love to explore that, particularly with people who think about statistical artifacts associated with the way that we've done it here. But ultimately, what it gives us are integrated scores associated with each of those 4 variables I just mentioned, and we can then use those to think about how sustainability potential varies from place to place and what our responses to our hypothesis test might be. So this is just a painful slide to look at, but this is again from the Ostrom 2009 paper, and is just to show you that the framework goes so far as to, I think the next slide's better. Yeah, okay, this is a subset. This is easier to look at, where you have a series of second-tier variables under each of these primary variables, and we were able to match these to empirical data from our system. So we have information, again, on system productivity, on the size of the system that people fished in different parts of the coast, on how often that system changed in terms of its chlorophyll, concentration of chlorophyll A, a measure of primary productivity, or its water temperature, and so forth. So the other big piece in terms of an input to this work is to come up with logical units. I've been talking about communities. What we call them here are social-ecological system regions, and by that I'm referring to places that are relatively homogeneous along the coast. So fishermen are fishing for squid a lot in Santa Rosalia. They move fairly rarely to other locations along the coast. In contrast, The people in La Paz, down here in the green, they move all over the place. They're quite nomadic from season to season, and they tend to have a much more finfish dominated fishery. So this map of the polygons of consistent social ecological behavior related to fisheries was created in cooperation with fishers themselves and others who are expert in fishing in this region. And those data were gathered through surveys. We consider it preliminary, but it's certainly a lot more logical in terms of a set of replicate areas to test the hypotheses I described earlier than what we have over here. So here I'm showing you the 5 counties or municipalities within the state, and they have no relationship to how people are using the seascape. Here you can see that the one that includes La Paz includes both the Pacific coast and the Gulf Coast, and there's kind of an arbitrary cutoff here in terms of northern and southern boundaries. So this gives us a more logical set of replicates where people are behaving and interacting with the system in a fairly consistent way. And when we combine those two pieces, the polygons that describe consistent fishing activity and the knowledge of the social and ecological variables that give us some indication of sustainability potential based on theory, we're able to test those 2 hypotheses I laid out earlier. And we see 2 things. First, we see that the potential for sustainability of small-scale fisheries varies widely, spatially. So if you look across a given metric, so a governance system, the darker colors are places where there's higher potential for sustainability of small-scale fisheries based on the governance data. And you see that some places, like in the southern part here, as well as in the Pacific northern coast, there's fairly high sustainability. And if you look particularly on the Gulf Coast, where we've done a lot of our field work, there's much lower potential for sustainability in this one of the 4 dimensions. Also, if you look across the 4 dimensions, you see actually fairly little consistency. And this was really the surprising thing. We knew that it varied, right? We knew that. All sorts of theory would tell us that from marine and terrestrial contexts. But the fact that there's not a consistent variation among these dimensions was a bit surprising. And we can look at that a little bit of a different way. Here, I'm showing you just 3 of those 12 replicate regions, those polygon color blobs. This was the northern region that does very well in the governance dimension. But compared to the other 11, it actually has a fairly low productivity ocean environment, although a lot of product, a lot of fish and actually lobster and abalone are caught in those waters. So the point here is you can see just even from this qualitative mapping that there's real dissonance among these 4 dimensions, which suggests to us that there may be trade-offs, that maybe it's really hard to have both a lot of capacity in terms of sustainability potential in your governance system and to have the same situation across the other 3. We don't know, and that's why we need to do comparative work, hopefully here and in other places. So the significance of this work is, as I mentioned before, it's really, this, as far as we know, the first spatially explicit comparative application of the social-ecological systems framework, and it's a way of exploring how to bring biophysical and social science data together in an integrative fashion to think about these dynamics of the coupled systems. And that's the next step, actually, to get to the dynamics. We see that the potential for sustainability varies at a finer scale than how fisheries are managed right now. They're managed at a whole coast scale. So those polygons of individual areas are currently irrelevant in fisheries management regulation, although there's the potential actually to operationalize what we have here, which is part of why we did this. There's a movement toward decentralization, both in the federal literature as well as the federal regulation as well as in the state regulatory regime. And so we're working with local partners to try to share what we have here and make it more useful. And finally, the variation across those 4 variables, the dimensions of sustainability potential, suggest how to tailor management strategies. So if a place is really strong already in governance, you want to hold on to that. But if you have another place that shows up as fairly weak in a governance sense, as Magdalena Bay does, that suggests where effort might be put in, that there might be a possibility of strengthening one of these 2 dimensions. Well, we know how to do that. We know how to create or contribute to social change, at least in some contexts. What we don't know as well is how to manipulate ecosystems, right? And so that brings up a whole other set of questions and challenges. So working particularly in the Baja system, as I mentioned, I will be continuing the work there, at least for the next 3 years. And these are some of the questions we'll be asking, both specifically in Loreto, where Kara will be continuing her work as a UMaine graduate student, but also in other places. We're really interested in whether these trade-offs are a generalized phenomenon, and the only way to get at that is to come up with more regions and to do the same sort of thing in other places, whether it's in Maine or Sweden or in other parts of the world. So we're working with partners to develop those comparative analyses. And then there's the question of dynamics. What I've showed you just now is essentially a snapshot of the last 10 years of data from the region and what we think it tells us about sustainability potential. But to actually translate that into real-time dynamics of these systems is going to take a whole other level of work. And then the question that I'm always asking myself and fairly unsatisfied with the answer is, does this matter? Or how could it matter more? And that's something I hope we can talk about in the next few minutes. So what work might this relevance have for Maine's coastal environment, fisheries, and otherwise? Well, I think we do have a diversity of species and stocks that people are fishing. Herring, bloodworms, lobster, clams are all important fisheries to varying degrees off our coast right now. This is a different suite of species than I might have shown you 100 years ago, and I suspect it could well be a different suite of species than we see in 20 or 50 years. And so thinking about how we can prepare for the dynamic nature of the social and ecological system that surrounds us and that we're part of is a big challenge, I think, and one that I'm eager to engage in. And all of you are much more expert in the specifics of that than I am, and that's why I'm really happy to be here and to start talking with you about how we might do this work or something more interesting in the Maine context. But I will, again, coming back to David and Ruth's request to answer their big questions, I'll offer 3 ideas that stem from the work that I've done in this system. And first, I'd say that we really do need to think about interdisciplinary work as being integrative. That you can do a lot of fabulous things within your discipline, and we need that. We need that foundational work within the discipline. But for those of us who are interested in working across the disciplines, I think it can be a lot more interesting intellectually and a lot more powerful in terms of helping to solve real challenges on the ground if we can integrate what we're doing. And certainly that's been my personal experience with this project and others I've been engaged with. The second is that knowledge co-production is possible, and I'd say I've just dipped the tiniest toe in this water, but in our work in Baja, we couldn't have done what we did without our connections to the coastal communities throughout the state and the generous sharing of logbook information and knowledge about both the ecological and the social dynamics of these systems that we've had with fishermen and also with other community members. And so I think if you want your work to make a difference and make an impact, then if those of us who aren't trained in community-based research, we can at least partner with people who are skilled in that area, and that's what I've chosen to do, and think about how to frame our questions in ways that are most relevant to solutions. So by working with people who are on the ground, working with people who can make change, I found that to be the most satisfying way to do solutions-oriented research. And I think I'm actually going to stop there. This is something I would just like us all to think about how we measure and define whether what the work we're doing matters, and there's a whole host of ways to do that. But I'd rather start a conversation than show you more pretty pictures. So just to end and then thank those who supported this work, I hope that I've shown you that sustainability science and certainly the work that I've done, there's no one method. It's involved a lot of different approaches, both qualitative and quantitative. understanding spatial variation is really important and should be getting us closer to translating what we're learning into policy, although that's a long road. And this is the piece I didn't get to of my soapbox, which is that I think we really are, it's a mission-driven science, and we have a lot to learn and collaborate on from our colleagues in conservation biology, for example, who also are working in a mission-driven sense. And to achieve that mission, I think we not only need to keep our eye on why we're doing what we're doing, but also figure out how to measure how close we're getting. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions or comments. Thank you. Questions? Comments? Yes.
I'm sure you've heard from Bob Stenick and others about the issue of Maine fisheries being so dependent on a highly successful lobster fisheries, but that being a very risky position given its dominance. I'm wondering if you could take not your last 3 points, but the previous 3 points.
Yeah, there were sort of 2 levels of conclusion there.
6 slides back, and apply those insights to that problem.
Yeah, so to go back to what should have been my conclusion. Well, I think actually that this is the point we're at, right? Is that at least in my last 7 weeks of conversation, getting to know people at the Darling Center, sitting on the wall behind you, and including Bob, and also reaching out to colleagues in marine science and education institutions up and down the coast. I've heard a real hunger for taking an integrative or coupled systems approach. We know a lot about particularly the biophysical dynamics. Of course, there's always more we could learn, right? And that's why we got into this business, because it's fascinating. But in terms of bringing our knowledge to bear, I'm hearing that there's integrative questions that need to be answered. Answers where we need economists together with ecologists, oceanographers talking to people who are thinking about human impacts and how to quantify human use on the ocean using remote sensing as well as in situ methods. So I think that it's actually a really good moment to think about integrative research on coupled marine systems in Maine in particular. How you land on the right set of questions, well, we have some great examples of that. We have the NEST project that's focused on shellfish dynamics and water quality. We have coastal seas work that I suspect that some of you in this room are involved with. And so I think we do have some good examples of how to proceed with that. And I don't think there's one good model. I guess what I'd like to see is a larger market share devoted to this type of research, because I think, at least in the near term, both from a policy perspective as well as from the interest in the next generation of researchers, there's real hunger for this integrative approach. And yet it's, as David and I were just talking about earlier, this is still a really small part of the portfolio, say, of NSF. And there's a lot of disinterest, at best, among many in the funding agencies. So I think we need to push ahead and do it and look to examples that have worked. But I wouldn't pretend that it's easy or the dominant conversation. What do you think? That's what I should have asked first. What do you think?
I don't know. It'll be a challenge when I look at those 3 items. Yeah, I think they all could be helpful in terms of addressing this specific issue I talked about, the dominance of the lobster fisheries. But it's who's going to be the change maker who walks away from lobster fishing when it's so extraordinarily successful?
Well, there's no individual incentive to do that, right? And
Right.
so that's where higher level governance comes in, and there are lessons still to be learned from the work of Ostrom and others for thinking about the power and the interactions, power for the good, and interactions between local level organizations, whether we're talking about communities of lobster fishermen or the council at the zone level. And I see Bob, and I know that on the wall again there, and I know that he's done a lot of work in collaboration with the lobster fishermen, and a lot of the exciting and important biological information that we understand from that fishery comes from that type of knowledge co-production. But I think, again, the questions we need to answer now are not just about the ecology. They're as much about the economics of Chinese seafood imports as how things are working right here. Kathy?
I think an interesting addition to that, which I'm not sure if you saw out in California, was not only the knowledge co-production, but the sort of co-management efforts that are going on in the lobster fishery. I can't speak to the other fisheries, but with the advisory councils, representatives from different zones working with the management folks, they don't have the final say, but they do have input, and they've been able to convince managers who are probably coming to it on their own anyway, but not each zone necessarily has to follow the same regulations as the other zones and so forth. And I think that involvement is, on the part of the fishermen, allows for a better buy-in for all the sustainability measures that regulators want to put in place, and it's a pretty solid model for the fisheries to look at.
That's a great comment, and it seems to me like we have capacity at the state level to innovate, and there's been examples of that already. It's harder when you get to federal waters, but I think there's still hope. Yes?
Another note on who would walk away from, I can't speak for lobster fishing, I'm not familiar with anyone who does that, but it's somewhat important to know that in that field of work, it's not always available, obviously. Sometimes the shores are closed or what have you. So generally speaking, most other fishermen will have some other form of work, be it legal or illegal, that fills in the economic gap. So I think if you want someone to willingly walk away from something that isn't sustainable, then you need to make what else they deem more profitable.
Okay.
So that they shift voluntarily. That's my opinion.
Yes, there's a question from the floor. Bob?
Yeah. I'm wondering whether there might be another line of theoretical work that Buzz Hollings has gotten into related to resilience that's relevant here. And one of the things that he's touched on is that as institutions age, they tend to get rather brittle. And the problem that we're faced with in Maine is that most of the people I know, most of the lobstermen, really do think about the system in 3 dimensions and in a multi-species way. But the institutions have actually created silos so that the limited entry of the lobstermen is actually one that is valuable. People stay in there, but they lose their history for fishing other species. So the problem of trying to move forward and think about this in a multi-species way, the way you have been in the Baja, has a structural problem that's going to be very hard to get around because any conservative action that the lobstermen might take to maybe bring more biodiversity in the system involves species that they actually couldn't fish for. So this is this embrittlement of a rather mature level of coevolution that is channelized into silos, is sort of the way I put it. You know, you've got your clammers, as you mentioned. The clammers are in individual communities. Some of them are lobstermen, but you can't be from someplace else and become a clammer. And so I'm just wondering whether, while you're trying to think about this broadly, whether we also should be thinking about some of the specific problems that exist in the way you know, governance has evolved on the coast of Maine.
Yes, that's a really good point. I'm not sure what gets us out of that box, except I can't help but mention one of our findings in the last several years from the Baja case, where from an anthropological perspective, we've observed a system shifting toward the Maine case, where it's increasingly difficult to fish multiple species in multiple places. And so there's been this decreased reduction
in where fishers can fish and what species they can fish over the last 3 decades. And you can see it on maps. People used to be able to fish the entire coast of the southern part of the peninsula, and now they're limited to the chunk essentially closest to where they live. And there's good biological reasons why that that parceling makes sense, why you'd think that if someone was fishing close to home that they might have more incentive to conserve the resource and so forth, and that's been shown in other contexts. But the crazy thing about it in the Baja context, based on the survey work and interviews that we've done, is that it's actually reduced the adaptive capacity. Just like you're saying in the Maine case, it's made it harder for people to respond to seasonal variation, to switch to the other coast and fish something else in Baja, or to switch to a different species, because now they have permits that are specific to different stocks of fisheries. So it's in a different place, but I can see it going closer to where we are here. And so the question is, how do you back that up?
Trying to keep an eye on the time. A wonderful conversation, and if you'd like to continue it, hang around. But I think that would be a great time to thank